Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is a program sponsored by the Bonet Adult Ed Committee, Adult Education Committee, and also Kulanu. And Jerry's going to talk more about Kulanu later on. Before I introduce Professor Kaplan, I'd like to just mention that Brian Maloney is here. He's with the Secure Community Network, which is an organization that they work with Jewish Colorado, but they work nationally, focusing on anti-Semitism. So if there are any threats in the community, these guys become aware of it and act as a liaison with law enforcement. And he can tell you more later about what he's up to.
I'm available. I'll give you a card. We can talk offline.
Okay. Professor Kaplan is with the Jewish Studies program at the University of Colorado, and he is an expert on the Holocaust as well as anti-Semitism. He teaches courses at the undergraduate and graduate level. He is the Lewis P. Singer Endowed Chair. I'm not exactly sure what you're endowed with, but
we can talk about that
as well. I saw his resume online. I was going to just kind of walk through it, but it's instead of one-page resume, it's a 30-page resume.
Oh, jeez.
Run through it. Anyway.
We keep it really to a minute, it's fine. Or less.
So the discussion today is, what is anti-Semitism, a scholarly assessment, and the goal of this is to ultimately arrive at a vocabulary and approach to help us shed more light on what is a threat to Jewish life and security in many places around the globe. With that, I also want to acknowledge that hopefully the ceasefire will occur and the hostages will be coming home. So, that's been hanging over a lot of our heads, and want to just acknowledge that. Anyway, Professor Kaplan, you're on.
Okay, well, thank you so very much. Thank you, of course, to B'nai Shalom and its Adult Education Committee, especially, of course, to Pete Ornstein for putting this on tonight. Also, of course, for inviting me. It's really been a pleasure. I've been here for the first time only last year, actually. I had a very memorable meeting with Rabbi Mark. I was very, very impressed with the work that you all, and of course he is too, doing here. And of course, very eager to accept this invitation. So thank you so very much. I was asked to address the issue of anti-Semitism in the overall context of its current rise, which of course you're all very, very familiar with in so many ways. And I would like to do that from like an angle and point of view that I can really speak to, right? Namely the engagement with anti-Semitism and research of anti-Semitism in academia, and the various problems and issues and complexities, of course, that come with it. So quite a bit of it, of the broader, let's say, broader narratives. I will mention among others the quote-unquote Jerusalem School. I shed some more light on that in just a minute. Will of course be very, very familiar to you. But then I will also stress some different readings in which academics try to kind of move our distinct discussion forward. What should come as absolutely no surprise to any one of you is, of course, that there is absolutely no consensus on how to study it, on what it is, even of how to define it. We spent like countless hours, especially in the wake and in the light of October 7th, in so many different settings, university, beyond and whatsoever, even trying to kind of wrap our minds around or discussing kind of how to define anti-Semitism, who is to define anti-Semitism, and how and to what end, in many ways, of course, always, comes to the fore. And all of this, of course, has also a history and a distinct kind of context of its own. So, Pete, you said about like 30 minutes or something like that, and I can certainly kind of tailor it kind of in many ways. I want to address a number of questions. Of course, as always, with my students in mind, I actually had prepared some spiffy slides and whatsoever, but, we can certainly do without those as well. So I want to address questions of, what is anti-Semitism, right? How have academic disciplines and scholars conceptualized and then also defined it? What approaches kind of have they developed? What are some of the insights and shortcomings? And of course, also, since this is not neutral, objective, detached by any stretch of the imagination, what are some of the politics of anti-Semitism? Also, of course, in academia and among scholars, was really on full display. I've done the whole gambit of academic conferences, for example. AGS is the largest Jewish Studies conference, academic conference, not just in this country, kind of but beyond. And it was quite striking, right, in the ways in which anti-Semitism was addressed. And of course, not even the alleged, but in the point of view of the presenting scholars, genocide in Gaza and things like that as well. So you've heard, of course, the narratives almost ad nauseum. Anti-Semitism, that's of course a good starting point. You're all, of course, kind of keenly familiar that this is a term that also is very specific to a very specific time. We're talking, of course, the late 19th century. We're talking the German lens. We're talking about a journalist, and you pretty much all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the name Wilhelm Marr. Right, so in various pamphlets, especially in the 1870s, right, the victory of Judaism over Germandom kind of developed this further. So we really introduced a distinct concept. It has a little bit of a scholarly kind of patina, and this was distinctly intended. It was seen as an instrument in the newly founded German Empire to launch a broader political project, which was to set it apart from older religious manifestations, right, of anti-Judaism. These were, of course, people coming from within Protestantism, though religion was not necessarily at the forefront of their agenda, but along, attacks against Jews, as they perceived it. They, of course, attacked at the very same time the Catholic Church, not necessarily in that hierarchy of importance, and others as well. So it was really like the idea of developing a distinct kind of academic patina of like I just saw Shulamit Volkov in Frankfurt, right, her distinct notion of an anti-Semitic code, of making anti-Semitism acceptable, also in bourgeois German circles, middle classes and whatsoever, and also academia, with quite some stunning success. Barbara is rightfully nodding. Right, I mean, like universities were one of the strongholds of the early Nazi party. Very, very successfully done it. I studied in the 90s at one of the brownest universities in the country, Tübingen. The Nazi professors, their portraits were still on the walls. The first thing I did as a research assistant, talked to the medievalist who just came from Munich, from the Monumenta Germaniae Historic. I said, can we take the Nazis down, please? And to my surprise, he actually agreed. So I always like, yeah, okay, good. At least on this one, he was fine. So of course, it's a term, right, as the morphology suggests, like of opposition, right, to Semitism. Again, doesn't make any sense. It's like in the context of language, right? Languages, Semitic languages spoken, right? Of course, Hebrew is only one, and Arabic and others, of course, are others. That's, of course, was not of interest to those coining the term precisely, right? Of course, there's no such thing like Semitism in many ways as well. So it's literally meaningless in a sense. But again, that's not the point, right? By coining new terms and phrases. The reason why I'm spending, kind of more time on it, and also providing some distinct aspects on the distinct notions and context, is that there are a number of scholars, also a very prominent one, and prominent also Jewish scholars like David Engel comes to mind, maybe not, you've heard of him, in New York, very prolific scholar, often talks also to Jewish communities and so on and so forth, who recently renewed their call to simply do away with the distinct concept, or to in fact say, well, let's keep it in the context of late 19th century German and Austrian lands, right? And the distinct kind of notions of it. And let's not try to subsume every distinct expression, practice, emotion from the state level to the individual, from the harassment at the playground to denying jobs, to incarcerating and persecuting whatsoever, all under this one label, this one term, which then in many ways, like scholars like Yehuda Bauer, maybe recently deceased, Yad Vashem, one of the greatest Holocaust scholars, right? Unfortunately left us a few years ago at the almost 100, right? So kind of fought, of course, kind of valiantly, and others as well in the context. So I've said, like, there's really like we are using the term not because it's so adequate, but because we don't have a better one. And there's so many kind of shortcomings within it. But of course, the problem that Engel had, and also Bauer and others, is like, what terms like do we use, right, to replace it with? How do we replace it, kind of in many ways? And even scholars who have been trying to, if you listen carefully what I just said, like a minute ago, like I've been referring to, pre-19th century expression of Jew hatred, for example, as anti-Judaism or religious anti-Judaism. There's certainly a limit, right, to also using other terms as well. And sometimes we go back to, once of anti-Semitism, then we have the conceptual muddle that then also, our students get confused over. Right, so in many ways, of course, what we'll see is the distinct readings. And the one that you are very kind of familiar kind of with, and I'm just going to kind of reference this kind of real quick, in many ways, right, so is the distinct theory which are labeled the Jerusalem School. It's tied or associated, among others, with the late Robert Wistrich, who was an important professor at Hebrew University and also the head of a key center there on anti-Semitism, right, who developed this distinct concept of anti-Semitism through the ages. And that's the narrative you're very familiar with, right? So we have to go back to antiquity, we have to go back to like a monotheistic religion, a polytheistic world, and of course then we can kind of tease it and trace it as Wistrich done in his Magnus Opus on anti-Semitism, the lethal obsession, has, I think, 1,500 pages or something like that, right? So you can certainly kind of draw out a lot of it, actually, 20th century. That was part of like this distinct brief. So we have all the distinct notions for, of course, the destruction of the temple. We're talking about like the Roman period. We're then, shifting to expressions of Christianity, right? So the second monotheistic religion kind of on the block. We have like, competition, of course, there. We have distinct struggles over successionism, right, in terms of, right, so there is a distinct monotheistic religion, but now, of course, it's kind of going way back into like the medieval period, and so forth. Why aren't the Jews all converting to the true religion, Christianity? We have like all the narratives you're familiar with, right? The early church fathers, Irenaeus, and others, of course, will be distinctly pushing that point. Some of the key kind of staples kind of this, as you're keenly aware, is of course the killing of Christ, right? Jews as Christ killer as the key trope. That of course is evoked, never goes away in the also modern period. One of my areas of work, and I taught there for a while in the Philippines, right? So 81% Catholic, right? Given of course Spanish colonialism, long legacy, unlike in neighboring Indonesia, right, where you're Dutch rule Protestant. In many ways as well, right? So there, the refugees, Jewish refugees in the late 30s, early 40s encountered those distinct charges. You're not surprised at all, and you shouldn't be, right? Of like, like young girls, like, taking classes and whatsoever, and like coming home to their refugee parents and saying, I was called a Jew killer. Can you explain this to me? I have no idea, right? So again, right, there's also this continuity. It's not like an either or that kind of shifting all to kind of scientific modern racism, a la Mann, whatsoever, and stuff like that. There's certainly kind of continuity in many ways as well. So you have that, right? And of course, it's expressed. I was just in a conference or like giving some talks in Paris, like Notre Dame reopened, but the facade, many of you, I think, have been, if you look close enough, right, kind of what's on it. of course, in many ways as well. You have at the Saint Anne portrayal, right, the allegories of the synagogue and the church. It's not unique to Notre Dame. It's of course not from the medieval period, from the 19th century, but nonetheless, right. So again, that captures this, right. So the synagogue, of course, right, like with the tablets down and like whatever, like the allegory that was so popular in the 19th century. Also Catholicism in many ways, right. So, but of course, in addition. To those, also the shift towards, again, a chimeric Christian anti-Judaism, right? So, for example, ritual murder and blood libel, right? So many examples, of course, from the German lens, but of course, the first one we have 12th century England. Of course, the reference is to William of Norwich. Again, you're all familiar kind of with this. These are also distinct tropes. And so all part of this broad continuity, like through the ages in many ways. But of course, you see already quite different expression, right? Blood libel is a very different thing than accusations of Christ killer or other expressions, here as well. We have the shift, of course, to, and that, of course, then goes with some of the reforms within the Christian churches. Again, I'm just going to give you very broad strokes to make my overall broader point, right? So we have the changes, of course, brought about with Protestantism, especially kind of under Luther, right? So again, also turning against the Catholic Church. Here, of course, we have the removal, right, of the priest, of the authority of the priest, right? So like direct access to faith by faith alone, right? One of the staples of Lutheranism in many ways, right? So again, the individual, approach is important here, which then also, translates with his distinct take on, in the early years, the young Luther, in fact, was very pro-Jewish because he expected the Jews, now that they see the true Christianity, which of course Luther was articulating in his distinct view, they would all in the coming years convert. Then obviously also give credit to the greatness of the Protestant church kind of in many ways. But of course this doesn't happen. And we have, of course, a distinct kind of turn. You are familiar with, of course, 1546 from the Jews and their lies, which of course the Nazis cited ad nauseum in the 1930s and 1940s. Here as well. So also this distinct trend here. We have then the important shifts, of course, again, broad strokes, anti-Semitism through the ages, like to the modern period. We have the inflection of course, of racism, right? The shift from a religious anti-Judaism to, in fact, a scientific kind of anti-Semitism, a distinct, shift that, of course, has key repercussions or whatsoever. Of course, didn't start in the Enlightenment in the 18th century. There's certainly lots of precedents in many ways, but of course, some of the key factors, again, these are all staples of a narrative you're very familiar with, of like no conversion, right, is no longer the solution to any issues in many ways, right? So as, in fact, also at the time of Luther kind of was still seen in many ways, right? So now it can't be expunged. Obviously, a different repercussion, different solution kind of had to be found here as well, and we have really then the marrying of anti-Semitism and then also in the more scientific racism of the 20th century with all the repercussions that come with this as well. Right. So now we are in the modern period. Now we are approaching, of course, wonder upheaval there, and of course also soon with Nazi anti-Semitism and the Holocaust here as well. We have that also mixed in with key conspiracy theories, right? The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, key reference point for you. Again, we're not quite sure about the origins, right? Russian secret police in many ways, but of course translated in so many different languages. There was a veritable obsession in countries like Japan out of all places, right? Widely endorsed it, translated in the 1920s, was widely discussed. Some of my colleagues like Pegelow, for example, wrote about like all this synergy of like Nazi writing and Imperial Japanese kind of writing against the Jews and all of it, like this wave support like of Hitler, translation of Mein Kampf into Japanese and all of it and stuff like that, as well. That kind of goes hand in hand. Obviously never really translated, with very few exceptions in present day Indonesia, where the Japanese actually imprisoned, some of you may or may not know that, Jews as Jews, right? Not as Americans, not as Brits, not as Australians, who were just defeated by the Imperial Japanese army in 41, 42, but in fact, right, so now rounded up, imprisoned as Jewish people, and of course, like again, with the broad synergy between Nazi and Japanese occupation thought here as well. So this distinct notion we have, again, following up this or wrapping up with this train of thought and presenting the next trend, which maybe you're less familiar with, right? So here we have also in recent years by prominent scholars like Jeffrey Herf, for example, finding connections of anti-Semitism as perpetrated by and endorsed by the Nazi state, with them radical Islam, however conceptualized and defined. Here, of course, references or something I would have showed you would be those iconic images of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem meeting with Hitler in November of 1941. And you have scholars like, as I mentioned, Jeffrey Herf and others who point out, well, we have anti-Semitism rising with like Nazis and then being defeated in 45. Right in the Arab world, and the continuity there, even of constructs and others in the person of the Mufti and other supporters. And of course, they would point out that other Nazis found refuge in Syria, for example, Brunner, and others here, and then served as advisors also in Egypt, for example. Right, and then help to perpetuate the continuity there, right? So in many ways, then this, Arab anti-Semitism or Islamic whatsoever is like akin to Nazism and all of it. So, so more crude, but you certainly can trace those lines, and you certainly kind of see strong anti-Semitic sentiment or whatsoever long before October 7th in numerous immigrant communities, also in Europe, certainly, of course, in the Middle East, right? So there's all the various wars against the state of Israel, and of course, all of that is in the news again today with Hamas and all of it, and of course, the overall plank of the destruction of Israel and the murder of the Jews in Jerusalem, or now in the state of Israel here as well. As part and parcel of this overall shift, and by the 70s, again, there's still this broad, long narrative of anti-Semitism through the ages, with the alleged rise of a new anti-Semitism, And again, we debate that ad nauseum, to what extent is the new anti-Semitism of the 1970s new? Part of the reference I already started to summarize for you in regard to Arab anti-Semitism. The other key component, right, and that really has gotten lots of traction also in recent years, certainly post-October 7th, is that of left-wing anti-Semitism, Of course, you don't need to start in the 2020s, like as I have no doubt, of course, your rabbi also shared with you, you have lots of anti-Semitism within Labour in Britain, for example, right? I mean, a Labour leader, like Corbyn kind of fell over, among others, here as well. So numerous manifestations, but you have lots of, if you look at like the treatment also in the popular media and others, one might also think, or almost think, that like old-fashioned kind of right-wing anti-Semitism has been replaced by a much more pervasive, much more powerful left-wing anti-Semitism in many ways. And if you look at some of the kind of recent moves, right, it's like Elon Musk like doing an interview with the head of the AfD, Alternative for Germany, the German Nazi party, kind of right now, or fascist. I should say that's the narrative they are peddling. Right, Hitler really was a left-winger because, hey, the socialist, the National Socialist, he was really a communist. So by them, we are differentiating, like, don't look at us on the right. We love the Jews kind of anyhow. So the FPÖ is doing this very successfully too in Austria, by the way. Right, and so it's really very interesting. And then the overall notion you get on social media is that anti-Semitism is really almost exclusively a problem on the left. Right? Of course, if you turn everybody, including Hitler, into communists, then obviously it has to be in many ways as well. So again, that's kind of part of these distinct kind of manifestations here as well. You certainly have in that period with the new anti-Semitism from the left also being endorsed, what you asked about MLK, by more radical, also kind of left-leaning proponents of the Black freedom struggle right in the 60s and 70s in the United States. Some of you, of course, remember we have the important turn like within SNCC right to anti-Semitism in 1967. That was more like a pamphlet that the communications director, more like a think piece, wrote, and then from the media was turned into like SNCC has an official platform against Jews and against Israel and stuff like that. And then, King tried, of course, to kind of steer against it and stuff like, and saying this is not the majority view of the Negro population, his words. but like only a tiny minority and stuff like that as well. So we have those things. We can talk about this a little bit more later here as well. So this is the distinct broad read, right? You're all familiar with of anti-Semitism through the ages, as articulated by, in fact, the Jerusalem School and its distinct proponents. So now, of course, this is not the only one. I don't want to kind of lay out a broad tableau and whatsoever, but I have a few more minutes, right? So present then at the very least, distinct reads of scholars who would point out we can't really divorce like anti-Semitism as a very unique and very distinct form of course, of expression of violence, of exclusion, or whatsoever, from other forms of then often racialized discrimination expression and whatsoever. So they would, in fact, then also cite the importance, not just in this country, but in others, of course, as well. For example, of anti-Black racism. How this distinct system of oppression interacts also with anti-Semitism. And just to give you a brief example, in many ways, how many of you are still familiar with the case of Leo Frank, Georgia? Yes, perfect. Okay, very much so. Right, so you have, of course, the lynching of Frank, and among the tens of thousands, or thousands, in fact, of African Americans lynched at the beginning of the 20th century. There are also, of course, a number of Jews, and Frank, of course, was one distinct example as a carpetbagger from the north, quote unquote, right, coming down then to Georgia, being accused, right, of this distinct kind of murder, and so like a broad, of course, media sensation kind of throughout. But here you have a clear expression, of course, on how to explain what happened to Frank simply by looking at anti-Semitic tropes and whatsoever. Has to fall short, because I mean the way he was treated was in many ways in which the majority of African Americans who were lynched in that part of the country was also treated. So again, overlaps in many ways, and this is not to kind of equate or to deny the, of course, some scholars try, kind of uniqueness of it all, but it's a distinct alternative reading. Of it, and would say, well, we have to kind of put this in broader context. And of course, in another kind of crude reading of it, this is then often used or kind of misused or misrepresented, kind of, if you wish, under the broader label of, post-colonial readings and whatsoever and stuff like that. But again, that's an over simplification in many ways here. So let's then kind of return that I at least presented a couple of distinct kind of readings here as well to, of course, the question of like, what are some of the issues or what are some of the problems of like applying the distinct, term here as well, to use a term that comes from a very distinct period, right? So the 1870s, the 1880s, right? Central Europe in many ways, and then try to apply it here as well. Isn't it, as in many ways, then scholars like David Engel and others would point out, more adequate to keep it in this distinct kind of period, to use it to then analyze those manifestations. And some, of course, we have an anti-Semitic party in Germany that was voted with a few seats at least in the 1880s into the German parliament. We also have like a shorter, self-declared like mass movement, the Antisemitism in many ways, like with Austria and other members, of course, Hungarian, here as well. Wouldn't it be more adequate to keep it in this distinct period? Scholars then would also point out, maybe less so now, but for quite a while into the 1990s, that we might have also given too much importance to anti-Semitism as a way to explain the Holocaust. Right? These are like structuralist, functionalist readings who would explain it by competition within various Nazi agencies, by radicalization kind of the party, by like a cumulative radicalization, as one of them pointed out, Martin Borchardt and Hans Mommsen, as an improvising to a solution. What do we do kind of with the Jews, like with the way in which the war is going by 1942 right into, of course, then Ukraine and whatsoever, with more and more millions of Jews under kind of German influence. What do we do with it? And of course, then the war goes south. They get defeated. Stalingrad and others, of course, even more important in 1943, at the hands of the Red Army. And of course, then at this point, most of the killings kind of already on the way as a distinct kind of solution here as well. So this is, of course, not where we currently are at. If anything, scholarship has again pointed out the absolute importance, of course, of anti-Semitism. After all, why would you kill and single out Jews like nobody else? You have to have the construct of anti-Semitism here. But again, how do you label it? Do you label it as anti-Semitism? The Nazis too. And you might think, some who survived this for a few months before they were, found guilty and then executed, like, Hess and others and stuff, kind of writing about, again, various forms of anti-Semitism, right? What we try to do is, paraphrasing now, is not like a Radau anti-Semitism, so something similar, early, but more like a scientific one and like a detached one, and one, of course, that brings the kind of solution and like peace from the Nazi point of view, right, to the border question by killing the Jews and all of it, but a very different kind of form than described here. But again, different expressions can be all really successfully use the label of anti-Semitism here, and of course we are really looking at a number of key kind of shortcomings, right? So looking at one distinct example before wrapping up, pretty much out of time, right? A few minutes. Right, so is of course that we have now a number of attempts in recent years being done scholarly in cooperation with governmental agencies. I'm referring, among others, of course, to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, short IRA, right? So, who in 2016 came up with a working definition of anti-Semitism. This, of course, is a broader initiative coming from the Stockholm Declaration of 2000, right? By that time, then, of course, Prime Minister of Sweden, distinct initiatives, right? So that's a distinct organization, international one, to develop and fight kind of anti-Semitism, to, of course, commemorate the Shoah. They actually extended it also to a Sinti and Roma explicitly in this regard. But developing distinct definitions, and I quote you the one for 2016, it's kind of maybe also helpful for our discussions, right? Anti-Semitism is a certain, again quote, perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestation of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jews or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community, institution, and religious facilities. And then they go into numerous examples, 11, 12 in all, and about like 7 or 8 of them have to do with the state of Israel. And here we have what critics then pointed out. We can talk about that in two brews, of course, right? So, like almost the creation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Right, and of course, this is also, as the administration I discussed, very much specific to a period and time in which many of you recall we have violence and murder of Jews in Paris, right, in France, numerous other manifestations as well, which kind of underpin and push this organization to in this direction. And even prior to October 7th, the counterpunch, if you wish, was in fact, thousands now of scholars of anti-Semitism, mostly in the global north, crafting the so-called Jerusalem Declaration on anti-Semitism. Jerusalem Declaration on anti-Semitism, yes, also had some Jewish scholars, part and parcel of it. Alain Confino, unfortunately, died earlier, actually last year, much too early in his mid-60s. Why is play an important role there. Some Germans were also co-authors. Stefanie Schüler-Springorum, for example, head of the Center for Research Anti-Semitism in Berlin, and kind of trying to, kind of find a way, a working document of taking it up on and saying, well, we have to complicate this even more. It's kind of too narrow-minded. We cannot simply equate, right? So the authors have it like anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, right? What about like a Jewish critic, maybe even Israeli Jewish critic kind of in Berlin, young lefty and whatsoever, criticizing German government policies? There's a lot to be criticized. I'm German, I do it all the time, right? So in many ways, and then being, as it's currently the case, by the special envoy of the German government, who of course is not Jewish, Mr. Klein, then being accused as being anti-Semitic because they're attacking, right, the state of Israel in many ways. So you have, if you wish, think about it for a second, right, the great-grandchildren of Nazi perpetrators criticize the Great Return of survivors or not. Of course, most didn't survive in Europe, as you all know. And that's, of course, an unbelievably problematic, to say the very least, kind of constellation. And so with these kind of counter definition, if you wish, some of those scholars wanted to correct it, which, of course, is not to say that there are not also faux pas and problems there. It is not to say that there are enough also activists, even scholars, who, of course, use anti-Zionism as a guise, right, for anti-Semitism. I mean, now, of course, with the barriers, kind of broken in many ways. I mean, there was always continuity of anti-Semitism, or you want to define it. In Europe, of course, after the war, never went away. Of course, when some scholars went as far as talking about the period of second Nazism after 45, at least in the 1950s, and of course they were right. In many ways as well, but again, it's a broader complexity that also needs to be taken into consideration. But again, what terminology, what approaches do we do? Right? Are we relying then on anti-Semitism? Is this simply kind of too broad of a term, an overall concept to make it all happen? Of course, there were lots of problems, of course, also with the Jerusalem, the JDA declaration as well. The almost barely talked about earlier religious forms, right, of Jew hatred. It was very important. Very much focused on the words, on linguistic expression. Wrote whole books on it, so I can certainly relate. But we don't have anti-Semitic practice or emotions, the emotional side of it, as conceptualized or grasped by those distinct approaches either. So of course, right, any problem with the definition, of course, is almost, by definition in of itself, you reduce a highly complex phenomenon, right? And so there's always, of course, a crutch, there's always a shortcoming in many ways. But if you don't, right, define it, if you don't conceptualize it, then you have the great muddle. If everything kind of goes on a label of anti-Semitism, then, what is there to explain in many ways as well? So, and of course we have, and maybe the final words in here as well, the ongoing, of course, instrumentalization of it. Right, you see it, of course, from the left, numerous expressions there as well. You, of course, see it on the right. If anything, I would argue anti-Semitism hasn't lost any relevance for the political right at all. If anything, it became even more important in terms as a glue to hold right-wing thought together in many ways, even, of course, with other notions like replacement theory. There are different words to refer to it, but also replacement theory is inherently anti-Semitic. In many ways, can't really go beyond it in many ways, right? You see it, of course, at the level of politics, right? In Germany, the German parliament just passed, even the government was almost on the way out, anti-Semitic resolution, highly problematic, I would say. Talk about it a little bit more. You see, of course, how it's instrumentalized in Congress. Right, the Republican Party very successfully used it to attack our elite institutions, beginning, of course, with Harvard. You always start on top. That's why you didn't see the president of the University of Colorado system in Congress yet. That's why you saw, in fact, right, the Harvard and the others kind of in there, because you always go for the high-hanging fruit, with lots of impact. So that's, of course, another component here as well, and you see it, of course, play out in so many different ways. On the one, of course, one might think, isn't it great that individual small German towns or whatsoever, Münster, well, maybe not so small university town, but nonetheless have all and many of my friends actually are in those positions, right? There are special representatives against anti-Semit in the fight of anti-Semitism, right? In Germany, for example, as well. But if they operate, right, with concepts and notions, that would mean that young, lefty or non-lefty Israelis are attacked, right, as anti-Semitic and whatsoever, as anti-Jewish, right, as anti-Jewish, and that's not rare. I mean, it's fairly widespread. Right, then of course we have a problem right there. So then maybe it's not such a great initiative and stuff like that as well. So I deliberately, and I kind of leave it at that, didn't give you precise answers or whatsoever, in the spirit, of course, of definition kind of and discussion, kind of setting up a few points and throwing out a few things which hopefully you're going to jump in and when we can talk about. So what we have then is really an ongoing, vibrant field of the study of anti-Semitism, which ultimately is not all that old, right? The early height was in the 1950s, so we're talking only a few decades, with important centers. Now we have at least more also academic centers. A colleague of mine just had the new one in New York, for example, at CUNY, right? And in Indiana, and of course the Germans and others and stuff like that will be doing it too. But and of course in Israel. But there's a lot of work still cut out for us, right? As of course the media, politicians, and others approached academics, especially post October 7th, like here, like give us some guidance and whatsoever. And of course, what you have is what academics do best: get at each other, problematize kind of even further, and then of course it's very difficult to translate it into policies that work. And in some cases, in which I tried to summarize, it wasn't all that successful either. So thank you for your attention. I hope at the very least I problematized maybe an all too familiar story somewhat, maybe for you. That would have been a success, and not just regurgitate stuff that you say, I've heard this all before. Why do we need this CEO professor come to our sanctum and whatsoever? So thank you so very much to all of you. I'm very much looking forward, of course, to the discussion.
So, Professor will be taking questions. Feel free to raise your hand.
Yeah, of course.
Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned, in your introduction, the accusation of genocide.
Yes.
Would you consider that an equivalent of a blood libel or not?
Well, again, depends on how it's done. Right, so and how it's been used kind of in many ways. If we see it, there's certainly kind of one strand in which it fits very, very neatly into, like, let's say the Hamas or Hezbollah narratives, right? In which I would simply do like a reversal, right? So in terms of like the genocidal onslaught, then is then against the state of Israel, turning the thing on its head, right? And so there are certainly some constellations in which you can certainly make this case, which is, of course, not to say that, if we discuss it like in scholarly circles, or I referenced the conferences like earlier, AGS and even the AHA was pretty dominant in this regard. There's a number of panels on the topic that I wouldn't accuse my colleagues there, right, as being anti-Semitic or engaged in a form of blood libel by talking about like genocide in Gaza, for example, right? So, but it is quite telling, and I was also just, at least virtually, because we can't travel kind of right now. Hopefully, it will now get better with the ceasefire. In Yad Vashem with the colleagues there, and of course, like they are bogged down by again explaining and debating, right, the meanings of genocide. We thought we were gonna run past it or whatsoever, but because again it's so much used also against Israeli institutions, not just the army, of course. But yeah. Thanks. Yes, please.
So in your discussion, you didn't bring up the protocols of the elders of Zion in your discussion. In your classes, does that come up? Is the spread of anti-Semitism?
What strikes me in many ways is like how little my students know. No, seriously, and not, I mean, with some of my non-Jewish students, well, sure, right? It's like almost like the distinct kind of reads that like the story, if they get anything. I mean, like the teaching of the Holocaust is like mandated in Colorado, but how? Right? It has to be mentioned like in one class and whatsoever and stuff like that, and you can get by with a couple of days in the classroom. And then even some of the teachers have done lots of teacher training over the years, especially like on the East Coast. And I was always like surprised, like even some of the teachers like spouting anti-Semitic stereotypes. So that, wait a second, let's analyze that. Let's put this like on this, make this a teachable moment, right, and stuff. And they said, oh, so you're saying the Jews are not all wealthy? Oh yeah, okay, I can see that. It's right? So it's really quite stunning, even like on that level in many ways. So therefore, so I've actually started to offer something I thought I would never have to do, but I really feel the need of having like larger classes on anti-Semitism, right, to explain kind of some of those dynamics and whatsoever, and stuff like that, and give them something to go by, not just to simply jump at the age of like social media at like, I'm pro-Palestinian or I'm against them whatsoever. I'm wearing a certain piece of clothing or I don't wear a certain piece of clothing. Am I popular with my other friends or not, and stuff like that, right? So it's really quite striking. Now, obviously, of course, if I talk to like Jewish students on campus and stuff like that, I mean, they've all been through education. Of course, some are also from Bonet and whatever, and of course they have this all down, the basics and all of it. But of course they come with their own distinct read, where we had this discussion just yesterday in regard to saying, well, of course I have to equate, one of the students said, like criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, right? That's where it's coming from. I said, like, really, right? So let's think about this together. Can you imagine in which also like Jewish critics or sorry, Israeli critics like might not be anti-Semitic, kind of would say something like that. Are we allowed to criticize our government? Hopefully we will be. There's not going to be a lot to criticize. Was and will be right in this regard, right? So, but yes, definitely. So, but no, I was really stunned in many ways, and in part, if you think about the various shifts, even the time I've spent in the States since end of last century, it's like teaching to the test. No child left behind, right? That's a whole different era we've already forgotten, right? Now that we're facing Trump too, right, and stuff like that, and it's just had really a tremendous impact on the students, like who come then also to university. And rather not necessarily a good one in many ways, right? And so then the idea is like how do you maybe not like feed them with like facts or whatever and stuff like that. I mean, we can all look stuff up even easier now with social media, but have them kind of start thinking about some of those issues and problematizing it. Right, which is like my point is like I don't indoctrinate. There's not like one read of anti-Semitism, right? If you don't get it at the end of the semester, you don't get an A. No, that's not the point. If you can criticize it very well at the end of the semester, then you get an A. If you criticize me, then you get an A+, right? Even better and stuff like that. Right? No, that's they don't always get this, right? Because teaching the test, like what do I have to put down? I said I don't do quizzes, right? It's no. What's the point? You forget it in a week, well, in the day, well, in 10 hours, right, and stuff, and then it's gone. It's like, what's the point? But like some of those skills, right, hopefully, right, you carry with you a little bit longer. So, yes, please.
So there's a lot of distance between criticizing Israeli policies and going the distance to really attacking the legitimacy of the state itself. So my question is, I wrote it down, so I want to get it right.
Good.
In your opinion,
Yes.
is anti-Zionism, as it is expressed in the West today, which by and large is a call for delegitimization of the state, is that a manifestation of anti-Semitism, or at least a de facto anti-Semitism?
No, it's a very good point, and of course it's very much like debated and will be, of course, for quite a while, both in scholarly circles, also my classes, and so in many ways, of course, I mean there's not a black and white answer, right? So there's certainly distinct expressions kind of offered, and that's also what in part the JDA, right, so the Jerusalem Declaration, which I have to admit, in full disclosure, I signed. Right, so we'll try to draw a distinction that there are ways in which you can criticize a government, right, and the shifting ones on the right or left and whatsoever, without being anti-Semitic in many ways. And there have to be that space kind of still available. But it's also instrumentalized and used like in so many ways in which you have a clear-cut, merging of the two, right, that it becomes, and of course there are certain distinct, features that we would look for in this regard. Right, so like if you stop differentiating between like government ministers and whatsoever and start talking about the Jew as Jew, right, as part of the state and all of it, and then has to go away, and so like you kind of essentialize and you kind of in brush tones and whatsoever, and then you morph into anti-Semitic discourses in many ways. But I would not, and personally too, I would not kind of equate the two readily. There's a reason kind of why the distinction exists, which doesn't mean that it's not used this way, because it certainly is in certain circles and also with some academics in many ways as well. But we have to have, at least in my read, kind of this distinction. You have to be able to criticize it in certain ways, right? So again, not with drawing out some stereotypes, language, emotions, and whatsoever. But it's a very difficult needle to thread. Right?
So if we take it to calls for ending Israel as the Jewish state as we know it.
Yeah, sure.
Is that anti-Semitic?
I would certainly go in this direction, yes, without any question. Right,
So anti-Zionism is the follow that as well.
Yeah, it's a broad complexity with, of course, a history of its own, right? I mean, if you look like, see, I'm from Germany, right? So the East Germans were adamant, right? We love the Palestinians, right? We are anti-Zionist. Anti-Zionism, because that's the tone Moscow set and whatsoever, 1970s all over, right? But of course, it was at the time that couldn't come out, right? Even those like Honecker who spent time in Nazi jails and whatsoever, and saying like, we hate Jews. But they couldn't, right? That's how, because they were vying right in the 70s to be allowed back into the theater of nations. They weren't members until 73 of the UN, right? So obviously they can't say this, but then they use anti-Zionist rhetoric, right, as a shifra. And some of it was certainly anti-Semitic without any question. Keep, of course, also in mind there were so many Nazis who, of course, had the Communist Party book, right? And of course, like it's the first anti-fascist state. So complexity can go in many ways. So there's that broader history, and of course, not just the GDR, also other countries in Eastern Europe, right? And those distinct dynamics. But that, of course, plays out very differently now. Like, you know, I've been dealing with like anti-Semites very blatantly kind of all my life in Germany. It was very little, I still recall, like walking among them and picking fights and all kinds of stuff, right? But it wasn't really at some level not acceptable in the 70s and 80s. And German politicians who ventured in this territory lost their job like this, right? This is no longer the case. Right now, you can do all kinds of stuff. Now you have like Höcker, now you have like Weigel, now you have all the AfD greats and whatsoever, right? Strongest party in some of the East German states, so maybe in the West we'll find out. Elections next month, right, and stuff like that. So no, it's kind of all too real, but that's like the threshold has passed in many ways, and some of the stuff gets more acceptable and it's mainstream. And of course, you see it in this country too, and play out slightly differently, of course, as well. But yeah.
I think the problem may be that we try to define something we don't understand.
Yeah.
And we don't really examine the structure. And instead we look at external manifestations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's sort of like looking at a rash and seeing only the rash rather than what may be under the skin. So in many ways you elucidated some of those foundational narratives of anti-Semitism that even though they have changed throughout history, as you outlined, they have something very much in common. And have in common with anti-Zionism as well. And it has to do with the following. One, from the time the Jews were first expelled from and had the first temple destroyed, every single narrative, whether it had to do with anti-Judaism, whether it had to do with the Catholic supersessionism, whether it had to do with Islam, whether it has to do with any of Karl Marx or Stalin or whoever, was based on the notion that Jews are not allowed to have power and access and have their own identity. That has kind of been the way that the entire world has approached Jews. If they have power, it's because they're conniving and they're cabal. If they are rich, it's because they are greedy. If they are focusing on education and they're very educated, it's because they want to control us that way. So Jews always had to be deprived of power. You know, it's the French and the German that discussed in the 18th century whether or not Jews should have equal rights. Okay, so everything is pervaded by those notions. And so is the attitude to what people call anti-Zionism. Jews are not supposed to have power. If Jews have their own state, then they interact with other states on a state-to-state level. If Jews don't have their own state, they are always a minority that can be oppressed. And certainly our history has shown that. So I think that when we look at, you know that I've taken a number of courses at CU.
Sure.
And I've taken your course, I've taken, I think, 4 other ones. All from the Jewish study program.
Yes.
I think if we analyze the offerings, the curriculum, how those courses are taught, even in Jewish Studies department, by people who I think are very sincere and want to do a good job at what they're doing, I think we would find many of these anti-Semitic narratives that weave their way through those courses and affect how they are taught. And those kind of narratives have been nourished primarily in academia. And during Nazi times, in Germany, in Poland too, in France. And we look at it as piecemeal things, like during the congressional hearings when Elise Stefanik asked, if people call for extermination of Jews, is that anti-Semitic harassment and so on. I mean, I think that she pointed to something important, but we still miss this kind of structural analysis that will make people see what they don't see, even when they think they are really well-meaning.
Yes, there's a lot there. So how much time do we have? So no. So obviously I wouldn't walk around and point the fingers at my colleagues in Jewish studies and say you are anti-Semitic, especially me as a German, right? No, definitely wouldn't do that. Right. So no, I wouldn't do that. But I mean, obviously, right? I mean, so but that's the question. I mean, like I assign, of course, a speech from Hitler in some of my classes. Doesn't make me a National Socialist, obviously not in this regard. But of course, we're discussing Nazi lingo, well, in translation because they don't read German, for the most part, and stuff like that as well. So obviously there are some of those notions and stuff that enter in. I would say that the colleagues in Jewish studies are trained well enough, beyond well, to be able to detect this and whatsoever, which doesn't necessarily, I mentioned the secondary school kind of teachers earlier being asked to teach a unit on the Holocaust, whatever, for a week, because now there's a mandate and whatever. So maybe, yes, you see some of that they're spewing kind of anti-Semitic stereotypes. Is it maybe also done by some of the colleagues here kind of on campus? And we also have adjuncts and all kinds of stuff, and maybe some also with the political agenda and stuff like that. Maybe less here, but maybe in Denver and stuff, right? So yeah, certainly. I mean, I'm not saying that, so that academics are are all neutral and objective and don't have a politics of their own. Quite very, very far from it, of course, in many ways as well. So that's the one thing. The structural aspect, of course, is of critical importance, right? And even the definitions I started to discuss towards the end, right, like the JDA, for example, right? So the Jerusalem Declaration is strikingly devoid of structural analysis, right? It's exactly as you're saying, with the rash, language and distinct concepts and whatsoever. That's certainly a shortcoming of it. So now, of course, you, of course, in many ways implicitly kind of endorse a very powerful reading of colleagues like Wistrich and whatsoever. We have this continuation, despite of all the divergences and different paths and whatever and stuff like that, that there is some continuity there. And but of course the way in which you had to do it was to bring it on a very kind of macro level of power, right? And denying Jews power and stuff like that as well. So if you look at the in progressivism in for example, power and space, right? So power and space or land, right? So if you look at, since I gave the example of Leo Frank, the South, right, doing progressivism, right? So wouldn't you also say to an extent that the way in which African Americans kind of were treated there, by white supremacist power, we can't give African Americans power. We can't certainly give African Americans land or space and whatsoever. So then it starts to look, right, from that angle, kind of like an over, which is not, again, arguing against the uniqueness of anti-Semitism if we accept that label. But certainly it becomes problematic in a sense because you have to abstract so much of it, right? That then so then how is it different overlaps with experiences, of other racialized kind of minorities in many ways as well. But then is that really threatening, right? To do a comparative, not to equate, but a comparative aspect and see what are some of the unique features, right? That are directed in this oppression, persecution of Jews, if we can contrast and compare it to experiences of others. But to what extent is it then really this continuity of so many centuries? There, of course, are also periods in which we're just treated very, very differently, and even amicably and whatsoever. Often didn't last very long and whatsoever, but certainly, right? And aren't we more prone of like doing a disservice by trying to stick to this large global categories. Shouldn't we like think of like developing specific other terminologies that would allow us to attest to the uniqueness, right, of Jewish experiences, but the changes over time, right, that maybe are more prevalent than continuities in this regard as well. And of course, then we have a distinct issue because, you know, anti-Semitism is not just like a scholarly or political term, right? There are also like emotions attached to it and all kinds of stuff. And if we take away with it, I mean, it's a certain cachet, a certain power, certain oomph, right? That also came in your comments. If we then develop another term, right, more abstract, more jargony, more whatever and stuff like that, then do we have something similar? Are we offending people? Are we like, you know, then with that kind of pushing in the direction of like moving against the uniqueness of this distinct persecution experience as well? So these are some of the problems here as well. So I see like problems and issues really fine in the sentence, like, you know, for various ways to approach this. But I hear you, and you're certainly making some excellent points. And yes, I will be the last one to say, changing my tune slightly over the months, that there are no manifestations, however defined, of anti-Semitism at CU. Well, there certainly are. In other places, of course, as well.
Well,
So I'm not standing here as like as apologetic toward my institution and say, no, I'm a good party soldier. You will never see anti-Semitism at CU because you will if you look close enough.
I think it's very difficult for Jews to discuss
Yes.
anti-Semitism, and especially when you include Israel, because one, we did have power in space, and we needed power in space for our own continuity. And at the same time, like, I went to school with Arabs that were thrown out of their villages.
Yeah, of course.
And saw horrific things by the Israeli army and by the other groups, and so as Jews, we don't teach the Nakba, and growing up in the 60s, seeing the rise of anti-Semitism on the left, especially since the occupation, knowing that the Jewish community, by and large, has been silent about the occupation, although it's been documented by B'Tselem for years.
Yeah.
And by and large, the American Jewish community has been silent about the terrorist state within Israel, the settlers, and the pogroms they commit. That I understand why some people are anti. If the Jewish community is silent in the face of atrocities committed by Jews, and I'm not talking about Gaza.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just taking that completely out of the picture. Okay, in fact, that's really conveniently. I don't mean conveniently in demeaning sense, but it allows people not to talk about anything else. That if I see a Jewish community that is silent when Israel does horrific things and violates people's rights, that are even documented by other Israelis and are even talked about in the Israeli press, then it's easy. It would be easy for me to take that feeling against Jews because of their silence, and that's what I see happening for some people.
Yeah.
So my background is a lot different because I grew up with Arabs that were victims of Israel, and I know what's happened, SNCC and all that.
Yeah.
I mean,
Sure.
yeah. So, and that's a discussion that we don't want to have in the Jewish community.
No, of course.
And so then we'll just say that everybody that's against Israel is anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
They may be, and the evolution could have produced that, but there's a reason for a certain segment that there's a reason for it.
Yeah.
And you can't ignore it.
Yeah. No, I think
That's
it's
what I want to say.
no, but I think it's also important, like even of course to. What's very obvious in internal discussions, of course, that there is a broad variety kind of opinions, and even that. So I mean, the problem we had, if you look at like how, going back to our topic of anti-Semitism and how it's studied and conceptualized and whatsoever, for example, in post-war Germany, it was done without Jews, right? There were lots of Gentile scholars dominating the field. And developing terms and concepts and whatsoever, or teaching it like we don't have a Jewish problem even with those words, right? Because there are no Jewish students in the class. And why aren't there Jewish students anymore, right? Whatsoever. So there is no, so like the lack of awareness and sensitivity, right? So it's that's what I'm trying to say is like it's very, very difficult conversation without any stretch of imagination, but it's very, very important to be part of the ongoing discourses and not to withdraw kind of too much, as tempting as it might be, right? Like the reflection, whatever, in which like current Israeli politics and Netanyahu whatsoever is then turning against the and all kinds of things, and no longer being part of it and withdrawing, and then like the internal discussion might still work within Israeli media and stuff like that as well. But there's really kind of giving up kind of quite a bit and kind of being part of the broader discussions, scholarly, political, and whatsoever is really key. But no, I totally agree. It's very, very difficult. It's very painful. But many, of course, are doing it. Also in Israel, I mean, the numbers are shrinking, but like colleagues of mine at Hebrew University been teaching the Nakba for a very long time and written books on it, and of course got into tremendous trouble. Right? So it's all the Watchdog and other organizations and stuff like that. But even to point out that this is also going on, right? There's not like this uniformity of views like in Israel whatsoever, but lots of internal discussion, lots of like colorfulness and whatsoever would be at least one baby step. But we have like 3 more, I think. Yes.
As probably the only Gentile in the room, question.
Yeah.
How does one or a society combat the drift from anti-Israeli policy to anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism?
Yeah.
How do you combat the drift? Because it seems to me, from my experience, people are happy. They some of these groups and if you go far right and you go far left, you end up at the same place. And I don't quite understand how do you combat that drift?
No, that's an excellent point. You know, that's of course implicit in all the things kind of we have said. I mean, why are we studying anti-Semitism? Why we're looking at this phenomenon, just not as simply as an academic exercise, because this is just too pertinent and the repercussions are too dire and continue to be dire, of course, in many ways as well, right? So, but you know, so there's also, of course, like a broad discourse analysis to be had about ways to combat and failed ways to combat as well. I've been going through like endless catalogs, publications, even from German Jewish organizations throughout the 1920s, right? CV-Verein, very, very active in fighting anti-Semitism, fighting the Nazis and stuff like that. When like the Zionist Organization of Germany, like, nope, we kind of turn inward. Eventually they came around too. But, even knowledge, education, all of it failed. Right, so we have all kinds of stuff, but it wasn't powerful enough to overcome some of the sentiments and whatsoever. So there is no kind of one distinct approach we can all settle and agree on, right? That this is the way to combat anti-Semitism, right? So you have structures, right? Government structures, power, right? So we introduced like offices, like, and of course, or we pass resolutions, right? in the council and stuff like that. And so, but then of course the question is like, again, how do you define it? That's again how it starts. Part of our premise, our discussions here. Then how do you instrumentalize it, and how do you then grasp it, and then how do you fight it? And of course, always being aware that can easily be instrumentalized and turned on its head and used against you, right? So that's the frustrating part of it. There's no really clear kind of one path or whatsoever to do and bring it about. And part of my frustration as a Holocaust studies scholar, of course, has been doing that for quite a while, is like to see like how little ultimately kind of we have accomplished. Right? I mean, there are a plethora of works, right? I edited maybe too many books, right? We have large collections like Holocaust testimonies, 200,000 oral, like audio, visual, and whatsoever. It's all available, it's all at our fingertips, right? We have invested so much in whatsoever. Did it do anything to stop anti-Semitism in many ways? Did it counteract anything, right? So it's really frustrating in many ways. So that's why saying earlier, it's high time, it's past high time, right, to develop different approaches. Because some of this, what we've been doing, and I include myself, simply doesn't work, right? So we have to do something else, right? And so, but again, in which direction is all depending on it. Right, so yes, please, in the back.
Yeah. So you talk about maybe we shouldn't call it anti-Semitism. You know, that term was something that was a construct, and we need to work around the constructs. But how do you explain that through time, it's the same caricature, you know, very, very deeply overlapping caricatures and profiles of what the Jews are doing to the rest of the world. Like, you know, whether it's we killed Christ, or it's we have big noses and lots of money, like that. These things like continue over over the centuries and generations, even to today. So, whatever you want to call it, why is it so pervasive and consistent across time and location?
Yeah, why the Jews, right? It's a
Why
very
the
simple, yeah, so in many ways, right? Yeah, no, of course there are continuities, and I didn't deny this whatsoever, right? I mean, we can easily trace it in all kinds of ways. I mean, you can do it with text, right? Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? In the visual version, I have like, Japanese translations, Arab translations, Syria, like the Russian original and whatsoever and stuff like that, right? So, but again, they're very specific and distinct kind of context in which they're used and played out, and there are also very important kind of differences in many ways as well. And again, the problem is like if we want to kind of fight something in many ways, right? The premise is like to then grasp and understand it, and then kind of figure out ways to approach this. But it doesn't mean that there were not elements of continuity, but at the very same time, also a strong discontinuity.
No, why are they? That's, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to ask is the caricatures are consistent, the contexts are different.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't the caricature be different if the context is different? Why is it the same caricature all through these different contexts?
But if you look at it, I mean, you also see, of course, in which, like, of course, at this point, given the importance of the topic, right, whole, monographic studies on, anti-Semitic boil depictions of Jewishness, right, the nose, the ear, I mean, that goes on and on and on in this distinct feature. But you also say there, right, that yes, there is again a certain continuity there, but also some distinct changes, like visually, like over the years too, like responding to all kinds of ways in which we use this thing kind of quote artwork or propaganda work, in which this is context in many ways as well. So there's not only blatant continuity, but there's certainly some of that as well, and some has an appeal, and some can be cited in works and can be instrumentalized and has a certain like emotive effect in all of it and certain appeal on the part of it. But again, the question is like, in what wins out, right? The importance of kind of continuity, and is that like the crutch? And of course, this is what proponents of the, again, quote unquote, Jewism school kind of would point out. Or is it more the differences and whatsoever, and the discontinuities in it of all? And shouldn't we then look into how this relates to other systems and then explain, why then this is like then intersecting with mass lynching in many ways as well, which is not necessarily something directed against Jews in the first place, but in different historical contexts. So again, it depends in many ways. But of course, you see also continuities in the treatment of black people, right? Like kind of throughout differently, of course, from many of the stereotypes directed against Jews, but yet we have that as well. So it just doesn't distract from the uniqueness, right, of Jewish experience in many ways by any stretch of the imagination, but it's parcel of it too.
I don't think the context has really changed. I think it's the same context. You can look at a country that loses in a war and they have to find somebody to blame. Somebody that wants to win an election has to find somebody to jump on and blame. And so I think the context has always been consistent. For me, that's what history says.
No, these are distinct notions like of scapegoatism, right? And early approaches in terms of studying anti-Semitism, also in this kind of like from the 50s. I mean, that's really like the main gist and angle that developed. And there, of course, is something to it, so and also shortcomings as well. But there was another question or comment.
Well, one of the things, kind of spinning off of what Ed said,
modern anti-Semitism, let's say from 1947 on, since the creation of the State of Israel, that has gotten worse, of course, over the past few years. There's such a lack of knowledge of the Middle East, of the history of the Middle East, which includes the history of Israel and before Israel, and the Jewish presence there. And I know when I work with kids, including Jewish kids, a tremendously limited knowledge of that history and the complexities of it and how that impacts today. And I'm assuming you see some of that also in your classes. It's upsetting.
Yeah. I mean, the conclusion is, of course, not to give up on education. I mean, so that's not the point. But again, of finding ways and whatsoever, and always being aware, of course, of limitation, and figuring out different approaches while kind of being in conversation, trying them out and whatsoever and stuff like that as well. Yes, please.
So you talked about how we keep coming back and trying to define anti-Semitism, we define it and then we redefine it. Does it seem like in academics, what's the process of trying to define it? Do you all come together?
Well, there's of course, there's even like
Like-
distinct approaches like to definitionalism, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not just, of course, in regard to anti-Semitism, right? I mentioned in passing like genocide studies, for example. It's a relatively new field, right? First we had the rise of Holocaust studies belatedly, but nonetheless, right, by the 70s and 80s, and genocide studies then more like in the 90s and stuff like that. Well, we spent really 10 years in the field of genocide studies over definitions, right? What is genocide? 10 years, right? In many ways. So there are distinct approaches, right, on how to define it, how to conceptualize the epistemological question, ontological questions and stuff like that as well, various approaches. And then, of course, like many scholars then ignore it anyhow, just go with it, right? Again, there's no scholarly consensus on what is genocide and how we should study it. Same with anti-Semitism in many ways as well. Some would even say, no, I don't want to define it. It's like a commonsensical definition. I mean, it's all too obvious, right? Give you a few Jew hate whatsoever, various manifestation, never changing over time and stuff like that. But then, of course, you have like a whole corpus of implicit assumptions that are still in there and that don't go away. It's not anything neutral and stuff like that. And then, of course, the range of what you're writing and working on is rather limited and like lots of forepaths. But they're distinct processes, which sometimes we adhere to, sometimes we don't, in many ways as well.
What motivates then the discussion to define the terms? Why are you doing
Yeah.
Why are we doing that?
Yeah, well, somebody like Engel would say, we're talking about anti-Semitism, trying to explain it, trying to develop ways to combat it and whatsoever. But if we can't even, if we use terms that inadequately capture those complex phenomenon, the tools we develop to combat it can't obviously succeed. Both in terms of from the point of view of studies, but many who turn to these topics of us also have implicit that we're going to combat it or figure out ways or help somebody to stop it. Same with genocide studies, right? Almost implicit is we don't want more genocides, we want less. So maybe the work we're doing can have an impact in this regard as well. It doesn't look like it, but still that's the impetus in many ways, and that's kind of part and parcel of it, and that's where in part they're coming from. That's one. The other one, of course, is like how academia works, right? I mean, it's the next study. It's like you do it because you find new sources, right? Hitler's diaries. Turned out to be fake. But anyhow, right? So, or like a different approach, right? Maybe it's time to go past functionalism versus intentionalism and go in a different direction. So there's also something inherently, of course, in academia, in advancing knowledge in many ways, that leads you sometimes to question some of those categories. So there's lots of dynamics in which it's coming from. But there's often, of course, also a very kind of, insular and like a different version of insularity, right, among academics, going over and over again, of course, knowing full well that, I just talked to some academic publishers kind of in New York, like Cambridge, Oxford, Columbia, usual suspects and stuff like that. And I said, well, the reading public, like of your works, right, is like shrinking continually, right? You're talking about like a few thousand people like who are still reading it, in addition to, of course, your colleagues and your grad students, right? And it's very frustrating in many ways as well. So then you think about like different ways, and that's why some of my colleagues or whatsoever went into like film, right? As being a consultant or whatsoever and stuff like that. Maybe reach some more people with film, like defiance or whatever and stuff like that, right? Right? Or so again, yeah.
You mentioned before that in the 1920s it was in the universities in Germany that sort of anti-Semitism was really bred.
Yes.
Was the same thing the case in Poland in 1930s?
Yes.
And obviously what we saw here last year in universities. Do you have that exploded in anti-Semitic kind of sentiment and violence and so on? Do you have a sense whether academia is kind of trying to reckon with that and do some self-examination and try to determine what did we do? How did we bring our best academic institutions to that place? It's not just that Harvard is on top. Harvard had some of the worst incidents, as did Columbia, etc., and some of the most elite universities. Do you have a sense that anything like that is happening?
Well, I think, like, for once, there are always like phases of reckoning and whatsoever. It doesn't necessarily the case that that's carried out like by administrators or by professors, kind of, or whatsoever. If you look at Germany, which is one of the areas I'm most familiar with, of course, in many ways, in academia, there you see that like already like in the early 60s, not even late 60s, there were initiatives by German students, Christian, of course, for the most part, much less Jews, to like even in places at the brownest of universities, I mentioned like Tübingen, of shedding some lights and inviting maybe a few people who've done some research like on that history, even with their professors, and are talking about it and having a discussion and having like a lecture series and stuff like that. And the students now whatsoever, right? To shedding what did our professors do, like, you know, kind of like roaming the archives, in this case, like they found like a framed portrait of the president of their university in SA uniform in the basement of one of the buildings, and then put this on display and problematize it in the student press. So there are always waves, right, of trying to kind of come to terms with all of it at some point, right, even with delayed in many ways. And here, well, you know, so I mean, in part, it was, of course, quite striking, right? Also, all the intention, and like you have many friends and colleagues, of course, like directly in Israel and academia and all kinds of stuff. And it was kind of quite striking to see like so many in Israel being so obsessed with what's going on at Harvard and at UCLA and whatsoever, even like in some cases more so about the ongoing war and stuff like that. And the media kind of, so the question is like, how is it portrayed in the media? What is really going on? Is it really the case that on every single campus in this country, right, we have anti-Semitic students kind of coming out and whatsoever and stuff like that? Is it really kind of that widespread? Is there something inherent to academia and whatsoever? And I wouldn't go that far. I would certainly say there's also certain media discourse that we need to break down and problematize, which is not to say that there isn't some of those activists. And of course, many saw this as a stage, right? Some of the activists who came, like at UCLA and whatsoever, these were not even students, right? Who kind of went in the fray and saw the media light and instrumentalized it in many ways as well. So there's lots of complexities, like not simply like to simply say, oh, what's going on with our students? Which is, again, not to say that it doesn't exist. So now the question is like, how do we get there? And how do we problematize it? Like, how do we figure out ways? I think in part, it's always the dance as always. I mean, the schools can certainly do something, right? So, like one example for me was, which I often cite, colleagues of mine at the University of Connecticut, a number of anti-Semitic incidents in 2021. And they decided, like, let's develop some courses, 1 credit, normally a 3 credit, in which we would bring larger groups of our students together to discuss issues. And of course, anti-Semitism was one, not the only one, but certainly a prominent one, an important one. And there was also a push by some of the students, not just Jewish students, but certainly also Jewish students. And they petitioned. And then some of the administrators come together, and some of my colleagues, some of the professors, and then they actually introduced that. And they had like now tens of thousands of students kind of discussing some of that. And of course, initially it was quite successful in problematizing and all of it, difficult conversation. Now at some point it gets too ritualistic and like too shallow and whatever. There's always that risk, but that's, and for me, like a successful initiative, and when you bring them all together and figuring out ways of problematizing that. I mean, how successful is it if, like, the ADL sends out emails which always like fundraising is underpinned. We just talked about fundraising, right? Because they ultimately also want to collect money out of this. And then, like, as outside, like with some information that's maybe fed to them by some of the students there who also serve for the distinct political purpose. I mean, how successful, how effective is that as a way to counteract it? I think, should we kind of leave like simply university to their own devices? No, I would not say that either, because there's certainly always like a reflex in which like administrations kind of act, right? Think about it. I've seen it too many times myself to change topics, like a case of sexual violence against a female student in which a faculty member was involved, absolutely atrocious. I have no words for it whatsoever, but the university's reflex was like, let's be quiet about it. Maybe we ask him to retire early, but we don't bring this up. We will tarnish our image, we will lose students over it and whatsoever. So you can't simply also all leave it to the university to take care of itself. So it's a dance, right? So some outside pressure, some others. I often, sometimes when I was in the fray, kind of try to work also with donor pressure. That sometimes works and get them to move somewhere. But it's a complex issue, complicated whatsoever.
So it's about 8:30.
Yeah, great.
And Jerry, you want to say something?
Oh my God. So Jen and I co-chair, and that's Jen, right? Co-chair Kulanu. And Kulanu is an ADL program for synagogues on how do we address anti-Semitism here. Not on campus, well, yes, on campus, but in our everyday lives. What do we need to do to address anti-Semitism? And we've done a bunch of stuff. This is the second year we've been doing this here with Har Hashem. And what we're looking at is, of course, people to get involved in this program, and Jen can tell you how to sign up, right? But to just give you some examples of what we've been doing over the past year is working a lot with students, both on campus, on having them talk about what they're seeing that they feel is anti-Semitic. Is it anti-Semitic? Is it a lack of sensitivity? Because not everything is anti-Semitic, as you just heard. How do you deal with professors who maybe are anti-Semitic? One of the things we did last year, which I thought was a big eye-opener for both the students and the administration, is we did a workshop with some administration on the campus, as well as Hillel students, both on what is anti-Semitism, what is freedom of speech, because they overlap. And one of the things the kids learned is we can't restrict speech. What goes on in the UMC, the river to the sea tables and stuff like that, that's freedom of speech. But what can you do as a student is maybe try to educate. You know, we talked about this. Education is so big. When you start screaming at river to sea, what are you talking about? And a lot of students don't know what that is. And at the same time, what the administration is saying, don't just come to us and say a professor's being anti-Semitic. We need proof. Your word is not enough. We need documented proof, which helps the students. So that was one of the things that we worked on. We've done a lot of stuff with our Hebrew school kids. This past fall, we did a workshop with parents at Har Hashem and at the JCC on, again, addressing what is anti-Semitism, especially in the schools. And a lot of what you see in the schools is not what I would say is in your face anti-Semitism. It's a lack of sensitivity, it's a lack of knowledge. You know, when you say you scheduled something on Yom Kippur, if you're not Jewish, you may not even know what Yom Kippur is. So it's, again, a matter of education, and it's a matter of letting people know you've got to do this. You know, it seems intuitive to us. We know what it is, but it's not. What? Oh, thank you. And what we're looking at for the rest of this year is to create allies outside of the Jewish community. One of the ways we feel to address anti-Semitism is to create relationships. The more you talk to and meet us as Jews, not as you see the stereotype that you mentioned out there, that we own the banks and we control the press and we're trying to take over the world. But how are we as people? And we're no different than you are. So trying to get relationships with interfaith groups. I spoke to Rabbi Mark about it. He's interested in helping us, but we need also other people to help us. We have about 5 people on our committee now. We'd love to have more people on it. How do you sign up?
You can come to me, but there's a Google form that you can fill out. We just need your email address and maybe your phone number. Yeah.
Okay. So, my email is in the book. Jan's email is in the book. For those of you members of Bonet, if you're not, you can see us before you leave. We'd really like to have some more people on the group. We're going to be having some meeting probably when Rabbi Mark comes back to look at some of this stuff. And it's a struggle. It's been going on for 3,000 years, and it's not going to disappear tomorrow. And Ed brought up some stuff it's true, and we got to keep dealing with it. We got to educate, and that's what we're hoping to do with Kulanu. So, thank you for what you're doing too.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, and of course, thanks again for welcoming me.
That's great.
Please know, of course, that the university is always open for you. There's it's a public university, right? Lots of outward facing whatsoever. This is in part why I held up and started to pass around the upcoming talk by Professor Doris Bergen, one of the experts on Holocaust studies intersecting with gender analysis. She's also an expert on the churches and anti-Semitism. Very important works out. Her latest one on the chaplaincy, so Catholic and Protestant chaplains in the war and the role in the Holocaust. Just won the Yad Vashem Book Prize. Not a small feat. She's absolutely fantastic. She is with us on February 6th. If you're no longer working
It's in person?
It's in person. It's in person there. It's a lunch talk, right? So maybe it might not work for some of you, but highly, highly recommended. And of course, there's so much more else. So again, you're always very welcome. We don't charge, right? Simply walk in whatsoever, and I can leave another copy here. So thank you.